Good evening, everyone. My name is Alessandra Abate. I'm a PhD student in the Italian Studies Department at NYU. I would like to thank our head of the department, Eugenio Refini, and Casa Italiana Stefano Albertini for hosting us. This is our annual graduate invited lecture of 2026, and it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Paola Nasti. She's a scholar of medieval Italian literature, whose work explored the intellectual and religious tradition that shaped medieval vernacular literature, with particular attention to the ways Dante engages biblical texts, exegetical traditions, and theological discourse. Her work has been particularly influential, demonstrating how Dante's literary project is deeply embedded into the interpretative tradition of medieval scriptural culture. By exploring the intersection of vernacular poetic with practices of commentary, hermeneutics, and theological reflection, she has shown how Dante's work is both shaped by and actively engages with the exegetical and intellectual tradition of the Middle Ages. She's the author of Favole d'amore and Saver profondo, la tradizione salomonica in Dante in 2007, a study of the Solomonic tradition and its influence on Dante's poetic imagination, and of I Morsi della Carità, Dante e la Bibbia in 2024, which examined the central role of biblical theology and scriptural interpretation in the Commedia. She's also the co-editor of Interpreting Dante, Essays on Tradition of Dante's Commentary by University of Notre Dame Press in 2013, a volume that helped foreground the importance of the medieval and early modern commentary tradition for understanding the historical reception of Dante's work. The title of our talk tonight is Dante's Dream, Universal Salvation Through Political Unity. Please join me in welcoming Paola Nasti.
Thank you, Alessandra, for this very generous presentation, and thank you all for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to actually be invited by the graduate community here at NYU. It is a real pleasure to know that students, value my work, and it is actually the best thing I could ask for. So thank you so much. So because we are actually in a context, where we are thinking about methodology and, we work as scholars who think constantly about methodology. Let me begin with a methodological observation, not about me or about you, but about Dante. So the argument I'm about to advance rests on the fundamental premise that has guided my reading of Dante over the years. He was a rigorous scholar of scripture who approached the Bible as a text requiring careful interpretation. His entire encyclopedic learning, I would argue, was directed toward this task, which in turn is inseparable from his own writing. While we are all familiar with the poet's reworking of scripture in the Commedia, no text clarifies his exegetical method more explicitly than Book 3 of the Monarchia. There, Dante aligns his biblical hermeneutics with the principle articulated by Augustine in the Doctrina Christiana and the Civitate Dei. As Dante notes, Augustine insists that not all scriptural passages are to be read allegorically, and that not all allegorical readings are valid. Rather, the literal and historical sense constitute the foundation of biblical meaning. Biblical interpretation must proceed according to two key principles. First, it must be grounded in the double commandment of love of God and neighbor, so that any reading that fails to build up caritas is defective. Second, it must respect the unity of the scripture, interpreting each passage in harmony with the whole. Dante adopts and applies these principles in the third book of the Monarchia, to defend a predominantly literal reading of those biblical passages that he thought were central to debates over the church's authority. And when I say that Dante operates a literal interpretation of the Bible, I mean that he engages in a careful analysis of biblical narrative, language, and context, while rejecting allegorical interpretation that violate logic, Aristotelian logic, the principle of caritas, or that disrupts the coherence of scripture. I wanted to emphasize this Dante Biblicus, as I call it, because his scriptural references should be investigated in light of his modes of studying the Bible. At least that's how I think, what I think. And they should be therefore, as such, seen as interpretive keys that shape his understanding of existence, history, political order, and, of course, literary expression. So in what follows tonight, I will examine key passages from the Monarchia and the Commedia on a series of ideas or concepts: human happiness, peace, governance, and universal salvation, in light of the explicit and implicit biblical sources that inform them or might inform them. My aim is to show how Dante's engagement with scripture allows him to justify the empire as a messianic instrument ordained by God for the salvation of humanity as a whole, humana universitas, okay, including those who participate only implicitly in the divine order he discerns in the word. This line of inquiry rests on the observation of a consistent feature of Dante's writing, which really struck my curiosity: his inclusion of the Africani and Asiatici in the Monarchia, and of the Ethiopians and Persians in Paradiso 19. These are populations or people situated within a providential plan that is at once political and eschatological for Dante. So my initial question was very simple. Why are these figures so central to Dante's articulation of both politics and salvation in key moments of his text? I will begin with Dante's treatment of these issues in the Monarchia, taking advantage of the treatise's systematic and argumentative clarity, and perhaps this will make things a little bit dense and boring, but I invite you to hold on until we get to the fun part, which is the Divine Comedy, of course. I will focus on the analysis of biblical citation in the opening paragraphs of the Monarchia to argue that if we attend closely to how Dante uses scripture to define some words like peace, happiness, and the nature of humana universitas, we must reflect on the fact that although his argument appears focused on temporal monarchy and earthly happiness and worldly human activities throughout the treatise, his terminology is pervasively shaped by a redemptive, almost messianic vision of the monarchy. In other words, even when his case for temporal rule seems grounded in the distinction between the secular and the spiritual orders, Dante subtly reconfigures this dualism in light of a unified divine order of creation, which in his view is fully disclosed in the age of grace through Christ. Thus, even when the Monarchia treats earthly governance, Dante remains deeply concerned with the eschatological destiny of humanity as a whole. So let's begin with the first paragraph, which is very famous because, of course, Dante here is defining what Averroes, defines as the potential intellect. The opening paragraphs of the Monarchia famously declare that the humana universitas, that is the people in the totality of its individual members, was designed to carry out a single specific activity, the actualization of its highest potentiality, namely its intellective faculty. Dante insists that a vast multitude of individuals is required so that the full range of human intellectual potential can be actualized. Otherwise, the perfection of the activities would remain incomplete. The scholarship on this passage is, as you know, extensive, and I do not wish to rehearse it here. Instead, I want to interrogate Dante's insistence on the universal and collective nature of human intellectual potentiality from a biblical perspective. Why, from we could say, a Christian perspective or biblical perspective, must there be a multiplicity of individuals in order for this potentiality to be fulfilled? The answer is not straightforward, so I ask you to come with me through, a little bit of a long-winded analysis. Focusing, of course, on the biblical text. So having established that humanity's goal is the actualization of its intellectual potential, Dante concludes that happiness, or as he says, beatitudo, is attained when humanity as a whole fulfills its proper ontological vocation. Yet such fulfillment, he observes, requires a further condition, universal peace. In this brief but dense passage that you see here on the slide, one point stands out immediately. The fact that the universal intellectual task which orders humanity towards happiness is itself described as quasi-divine. And that to support this claim, Dante cites Psalms 8:6. Now, thou hast made him a little lower than the angel. Now, this passage is echoed exactly in the same form in Hebrews 2:7. So, against prevailing interpretation of this passage, I argue that Dante does not simply invoke Psalm 8, but wants its meaning to be shaped by its Christological reception in the letter to the Hebrews written or attributed to Paul. There, the psalm is a description of human nature understood in the light of incarnation. Though through the incarnate Christ, Paul says humanity comes to recognize its participation in its divine source, becoming holy brothers, sharers in a heavenly calling. This reading decisively shaped medieval exegesis of Psalms 8. It's almost impossible to believe that Dante did not know this Christological interpretation. But if we wanted to look at more deep into this Christological interpretation, then we would have to obviously turn to Augustine, the most authoritative reader of the Psalms in the Middle Ages. And here, Psalms 8 actually, for Augustine, means that Christ descends below the angels by assuming human nature in order to reveal that, even in the flesh, human beings bear the image of the heavenly man. From this perspective, the incarnation does not simply restore human dignity, but discloses it. It shows what humanity is and what it is called to become. Now, if we wanted to look further, of course, we would turn to Aquinas, not because he says anything particularly new, but as you know, Aquinas is very good at doing things very orderly. So it's a very nice example to provide. Now, Aquinas took up and developed this insight more systematically in his Question on the Incarnation in the Summa Theologica 3. There he argues that, by appearing as a true human being, God manifests the exalted place of human nature among Christians, but he also clarifies this claim by distinguishing a double capacity in human nature. The first belongs to the natural order and concerns what human beings can achieve by their own creative power. The second belongs to the divine order, and concerns what human beings are capable of receiving from God beyond their natural powers, namely participation in the divine life. Now, the second capacity is interesting because Aquinas calls it the obediential capacity. And it says, everybody, has this obediential capacity, which is an ontological openness in the creature, a sort of built-in receptivity to being elevated beyond itself to realities such as grace or the union with God, which of course exceed human nature. Now, interestingly, Aquinas says that the incarnation in a way improved this capacity in human beings, through an act of grace. So after Christ's incarnation, we've actually all become much better at discerning this obediential capacity, because Christ operates as a sign of what we can become. In light of Dante's practice as a reader of scripture, attentive to the harmony of the Old Testament and the New Testament, something that he does throughout, the Monarchia, but that, as I hope it will become clear, he also does like in the Commedia and in intertextually between like his own works. I suggest that in Monarchia 1:4, he uses Psalms 8 to frame human intellective vocation within a Christ-mediated economy of grace. Later in the treatise, as you all know, Dante will explicitly articulate the idea of a double capacity in humans to be happy on earth and then happy in heaven. But importantly, he says that even on earth the soul is made immortal, and therefore the soul has a capacity to recognize God. What however I find important is that this the claim that he makes through Psalm 8 or the letter to to the Hebrews is like really the doorstep of the Monarchia. So he's setting the the pace for the rest of his text. And here he defines human beings as quasi-divine in biblical terms, not using other texts which he might have used, like he did with in the Vita Nova, where he uses like Homer, Aristotle, stroke to define like the divinity of Beatrice. It is because their intellective activity is ordered towards recognizing and conforming to the image they bear, that that humans are quasi-divine. The point, then, is not simply that humanity is naturally predisposed to think, let's say, but that it is called to think in a way that leads it back to its divine source. This theological perspective becomes clearer when the poet next links the condition of such universal human flourishing to the peace made possible through the incarnation. To demonstrate the necessity of peace for the orderly exercise of both intellectual and practical powers, Dante first recalls the heavenly message proclaimed at Christ's birth, glory to God in the highest and peace on earth. And then he reinforces this point by recalling the peace that Christ himself bestows on those gathered in his presence. Peace be with you. Now, once again, if we take this, citations seriously, what we realize is that in the medieval tradition, both exegetical, theological, but also liturgical, Christ's references to peace in the gospel were commonly glossed through a distinction between two kinds of peace: the peace of God and the peace of the word. The peace of God is, again, like dual, and here you have a citation from Peter Cantor, the Verbum Abbreviatum, which was a fundamental, work in the Middle Ages, but it's just an example. Here you have the peace of God, which is in pectoris, in the heart, right? And it's found when people have interior peace, because they have discovered, their role in the word. And then there is eternal peace, understood as the beatific state. By contrast, the peace of the word is either false, and when it's false, it's betrayal, tyranny, and so on and so forth, or it's merely temporal. That is, it guarantees some tranquility, but it's not. It doesn't allow for real peace of the heart. So, we know this is the theory that is quite common in the Middle Ages. That, of course, lack of conflict, it's not real peace. The peace needs to be both internal and external for it to be a real tranquility. So when people read this, this text from the Bible, they knew exactly what they meant. What it meant. It meant the tranquility within and the tranquility without. The tranquility within is ultimately grounded in adherence to the likeness of God, as we've heard now too many times. So again, having established this very strong Christological framework, peace, divinity, Dante then advances his political claim, and we know it, the universal monarchy can unify the humana universitas in a coordinated movement towards peace and the full actualization of its intellectual potential. So we do need the monarchy. But again, the interesting thing is that to justify his political reductio ad unum, right, under a monarch, Dante first cites, Aristotle, and then, as we've now learned to, understand, he cites, Christ's words as well. And interestingly, this is the passages he cites from Matthew 12:25, which occurs, in different shapes and formats also in the other Gospels. That is, every kingdom divided against itself shall be laid to waste. Now, this sentence is very important in medieval political discourse. It appears at a time and a moment when Christ is is debating with the Pharisees, and he affirms that only the divisions is breaking up their own community. So the obviously the kingdom of Israel. Now I believe that Dante here is not simply grounding political unity in the in the authority of the Bible, but he wants us to consider this Christological axiom a little bit more seriously. So if peace, as we've learned, originates in God, division on the other end signals separation from divine justice, and this is exactly what this passage meant in the theological reading, in the exegetical reading. So, for example, if we look at this Quaestio by Aquinas in the Summa Theologia, and this is like a question on whether the old law prescribed fitting judicial precepts, so a very significant, question in this sense. You can see here that some of the objections that, the opponents raise cite exactly the same authorities that, that Dante is using, the Aristotle and Matthew 12. Now, what does that mean? It means that Dante is, whether or not Aquinas agrees with these objections, the fact is that these citations are central to a discussion which is a disputatio about the monarchy, and that Dante is redeploying these authorities according to a model which is shared by everyone and understood by everyone as, reflecting about the law, reflecting about, and not only the law, but also obviously the Old Testament, the New Testament, and therefore also, the people in the Old Law and people in the Age of Grace. Now, in the Gospel, Christ's saying responds to the Pharisees' accusation that his powers derive from Satan, and he exposes the charge as incoherent. He says, no kingdom can survive internal division, not even Satan's word. So all the exegetes generalized this and said, whether we know that Christ here is attacking, the Pharisees, but this sort of axiom can be used politically. And in fact, if you look at how, for example, Aquinas again uses this passage in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, you see that he elaborates from this passage the exact, a discourse on, a hierarchy of communities, households, city, kingdoms, and so on and so forth. And the kingdom becomes, the best form because it is, avoiding division. Unity appears as a structural necessity and a condition of peace because, it is declared by Jesus as well. So we know this is like a position that Dante adopts. At the same time, and this is also interesting, this passage was also read spiritually. That is, interpreters were also agreeing that when Christ opposes the Pharisees, he's not just like looking at the fall of the kingdom of Israel, but he's actually revealing a deeper spiritual disorder, let's say. So this axiom, this sentence by Christ actually marks not only the political failure, but a departure of a group of people from divine order. And in so doing, division marks both temporal punishment and eternal judgment. So, again, within this interpretive framework, Dante's political reasoning in the Monarchia acquires a clear theological and eschatological dimension, but it's sort of subdued because obviously his interest is somewhere else. He's got to fight the church. He's got to establish himself as a philosopher, and as the philosopher who's going to advise this messianic emperor, right? But this Christological and biblical overtones are too noticeable not to avoid them. So if unity becomes essential, not just because you want the tranquility, the external tranquility of the humana universitas, but you want the tranquility from within. You want to allow, through unity and therefore peace, that people actually obtain access to that thing that capacity that Aquinas called the obediential capacity. You want to allow for the human beings to actually be to be put in contact with their divine image. Whether or not they do it, it's their own, choice, and that's where the church then comes in to lead them, in this choice. But, the monarchy has to really allow the condition that under which human beings can attain their proper end and live a truly redemptive existence. And as if we needed some more confirmation of this, when Dante, makes the final, strongest argument about why, we need one, monarch, he then, cites God as the example of, all the unity, right, that is required. So if the world is created in the image of God, then we must be, one like God, to be in his likeness. And once again, he cites here a passage from the Bible, which is both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. That is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Again, another passage that can be harmonized, right, between the two Old Testaments. The two testaments. So you actually achieve unity to be in the order of God. Dante does complete the arc of his argument, right, with this citation about, if you want, monotheism, right? So from the metaphysical ordering of humanity as quasi-divine, through the Christological understanding of peace and unity, to the foundational proclamation of divine oneness, which is the first article of the creed, right? So political unity emerges, therefore, not only as a rational and a moral necessity, and we know that Dante does, go through all the Aristotelian principle and logic principle that support that, but also as a spiritual and eschatological imperative. So while this messianic vision of empire, like might seem a little bit vague, and to some of us might not seem even like so novel. It's Dante is certainly not the first, not the last to, talk about, empire as having some sort of messianic role. What I think it's more interesting is that for Dante, this the monarchy is clearly non-confessional, right? So he says, of course, at the very end of the book, he says, of course, it's good for the emperor to be obedient, of the Pope and whatever. But, the emperor must not, be defined by his confession. And that's because it is created to redirect as many people as possible towards, unity, which, as we've seen, then will lead eventually to salvation if these are good people. So even those that are not aware of Christ need to be united. And so the universality of Dante's perspective is, as we've said, already implicit in everything we've seen so far. But this becomes, to me, very clear when in discussing his, an example that he's using, to push forward one of his theories, he says, if the Gentiles that are reading, the pagans that are reading, want an example that is meaningful for them, then here's the history of, Hercules' victories over Antaeus. And by addressing this, Gentiles or the pagans with a shared argumentative, within a shared argumentative space, even if it's just hypothetical, Dante signals that his claims concern humanity as a whole, including those outside the boundaries of Christendom. And this is replicated later on when he says that, the emperor cannot, the Pope cannot be, because he, is a confessional leader, the Pope cannot, be the universal emperor, because his jurisdiction needs to be recognized by everyone, even the Africans and the Asians, who need to be involved. We know now, because if they're not involved, how can they reach that capacity to be, godlike. So they need to be part of this, peaceful community that is allowed to discover, their divine, quasi-divine nature. So, so a monarch, is ideal because his ministerium is not defined by confessional or geographic limits, and therefore can secure peace and enable the intellective flourishing of humanity as a whole, while at the same time, obviously allowing these people to become Christians, right? To acknowledge the presence of God, that capacity to be obedient, as Thomas defined them. So, to a certain extent, Dante is saying that the empire has a sort of eschatological mission, but this is not the focus of the Monarchia as a text. Things become clear when we look at at Paradiso, and we don't need to read, Paradiso in light of the Monarchia and vice versa. But, what I will try to do is show you that this Paradiso 19 is tied through intertextual links to these passages that we've just seen here in the Monarchia. And so, it's almost as if Dante is inviting us to use a sort of harmony of Dante, right, through the Bible. in the poem, as we will see, the messianic political order argued for in theory in the Monarchia becomes visible in its eschatological effects, and we'll try to see how. So bear with me for this second part of the talk. As you know, earthly monarchy is symbolically represented by a miraculous eagle in the heaven of justice, which forms, like a biblical sentence, "De legite justitiam qui judicatis terram," which, it's a beautiful sort of firework, as Barolini described it, which is formed by all the souls of the just kings that Dante meets in the heaven of justice. Significantly, the last letter of terram turns in M of the Monarchia, signifying that the entire earth. So, right, it's Earth, but its entire Earth needs to, be under the rule of the emperor. Not coincidentally, though animated by the light and love of many earthly rulers, as we know, the eagle speaks with one voice in concord and peace, dramatizing the transformation of plurality into harmony as a reflection of divine order and will. But here comes Dante's revealing sleight of hand. Within this spectacle of concord, talking about the empire, right? The monarchic ego assumes a dual responsibility. It seals the damnation of divided nations or kingdoms who opposed unity, and it resolves, and that's the key point, it resolves doubts about predestination and the salvation of the pagans that have troubled the pilgrim since his very first meeting with Virgil. So the question is why, should the empire reveal this fundamental mystery to Dante? And what I'm saying is that political unity and eschatological judgment converge in a single discourse proclaimed by the imperial sign, because the eagle is chosen to mediate this specific, question as the messianic sign that Dante considers fundamental for not just for political unity, but for eschatological universality or universal eschatology. So since the empire provides peace, the God-given gift which allows humanity to be rightly ordered towards God himself, the eagle can address the problem of pagan salvation and divine justice more than anybody else in the comedy. This question concerns the ordering of the human world in which grace operates. So let's go through the text, through with a little bit of a closer reading, looking once again at the Bible, of course. But in the Commedia, the Bible is not cited, right? So the Monarchia is a treatise. So you can go and put your ipse dixit, and and then you can easily spot it. Oh, it's easier to spot it. In the Commedia, he doesn't cite very much. So, we got to see the Bible through allusions that sometimes are very minimal. So, throughout the episode, the monarchic eagle reminds reminds the pilgrim that the workings of saving grace are ultimately inscrutable. When he asks, what's going to happen to all this, to the pagans, and therefore, real knowledge is beyond the full reach of human judgment, let alone the judgment of the church, right? And in fact, here, the eagle says that the Christians are actually, false Christians are failing to understand God's justice, but they are failing to understand God's justice because they are not reading the Bible correctly. In fact, he says, if you had read the scripture properly, you would have an answer to this question about the pagans. And so the question is, what is, where the Bible says something about the salvation of the pagans. Of course, the eagle is saying, I know how to read the Bible, the church is not, and the false Christians are not. So in this way, the eagle is obviously exposing the insufficiency of performative faith as a mark of human imperfection, right? So Christian identity in this vision cannot be reduced to verbal confession or institutional belonging. And Dante, throughout the comedy, tells us very much that just a little tear is enough to be saved. So the institutional belonging is not necessary, but real obediential, capacity instead is. So to be Christian is to be Christ-like and to realize the perfection proper to human nature, which we have discussed at length. So for this reason, Dante actually calls those that fail to understand the Bible as terrestrial animals. They are not humans. They are failing the human capacity of being directed by God towards the right, discernment of truth. So what's going on here? The Bible is telling Dante, the eagle is telling Dante that had Dante and other Christians look carefully in the Bible, they should have found an answer about the salvation of the pagans. So where is this? Where can we find something about this in the Bible? And the key is in Dante himself, of course. In its invective against false Christians in Paradiso 19, the eagle explicitly invokes the authority of Matthew 12, the same text that we've seen in the Monarchia. So in the same episode, but line 33 to 49, and let me now check my sorry, because I think I've lost a little bit because I'm not advancing it. What's going on? Oh, okay. Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. In this canto, Dante, I argue, is also is citing another passage from Matthew. In this passage from Matthew 34 to 42, continuing to rebuke the Pharisees. So we are still, with the Pharisees to whom Christ has said that they are divided, right? Continuing to rebuke them. Christ also condemns them for empty words and performative religiosity. So exactly the same context that the eagle is having here in Paradiso 19, warning them that a weak generation will be judged, while the Gentiles, such as the people of Nineveh or the Queen of the South, will be saved. In Christ's rebuke, the contrast is once again directed against Israel itself, a generation entrusted with the law, yet unable to recognize the wisdom standing at its core. So the exegetes that read, the Christian exegetes that read this passage, explain that the Queen of the South, right, is the Queen of Sheba, that is an Ethiopian. This Ethiopian woman came from afar, as Christ says, to learn about Solomon's wisdom. She came from afar, drawn by Solomon's wisdom. Now, Solomon in the Bible is defined as the pacificus, that is the one that establishes peace. So it's also meaningful that obviously Christ is, it's like talking about Solomon in this context. So Christ says, the Queen of Sheba came all the way to listen to wisdom, and you have in front of you somebody who's revealing something greater than what Solomon had, and you are like lower than you are not as great as the Queen of Sheba. So the Queen of Sheba is above you in terms of, virtue and will judge you. Right, so this is exactly the same, the same situation that Dante is creating in Paradiso 19. So he's obviously reversing the logic, right? Because he's like now addressing the Christians, saying that they are the Pharisees, and they will be judged by the Ethiopians, who instead will, be more Christian than them. They will be on the right side of judgment. So the biblical Ethiopian represents those who, though distant from the visible structures of Christian authority, nonetheless seek wisdom in good faith and are capable of recognizing justice, love, and eventually faith, when it appears. Importantly, Christ's words on the Ethiopians illuminate an Old Testament trope on the role of Ethiopia in relation to God's plan. Ethiopia is everywhere in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as the site of the salvation that will come, as the site of people that will at some point be open to Christ. For example, there is very important, but this is one of the many examples in the Bible, Psalm 68, where the Psalm David or whoever says, at some point, the people will rise and ambassadors will come from Egypt, and Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands to God. Now, this citation will become fundamental for the apocryphal tradition of the last Lord Emperor, which I will mention in a short while. Now, how was this psalm interpreted? If you look at Augustine, this psalm was interpreted as actually talking about those people, those population that will be saved. So it's not like maybe they'll be good enough to be saved. They will be saved. So in actual fact, Augustine uses this passage to prove that faith is essential, whereas the works are not. Ethiopia, shall hasten to stretch out their hands to God means that faith precedes works, says Augustine, and faith will often remain implicit and only known to God. And if you think about it, here you have in this explanation of Ethiopia as implicit faith, right? And being more important than the works, right? You have an explanation for Ripheus, which is your implicit faith hero in Paradiso 20. So in a certain way, the Ethiopian in Paradiso 19 is prepared for those who recognize, the biblical discourse, as prepared, the way for Ripheus, who has implicit faith and is good enough through love to be saved. Now, let me just have a look, because I think I will need to cut a little bit. But what I'm trying to say that, the Queen of the South, Ethiopia, and Dante's Ethiopian, right, are all part of the same discourse on the not just the fact that, everybody is can have implicit faith because everybody has that obediential capacity, but that, at some point through an emperor, as Dante says, these people will be united and therefore will be exposed to what the church otherwise can't show. Again, not by coincidence, I think. Dante also reprises, another aspect of Matthew 12, that is the division of the kingdoms, right? Because once he has declared that. Once he has declared that, the Ethiopians will judge the false Christians, he actually immediately moves to division, right? And he has this long list, for those of you who know, long list of kings who are listed, forming an acrostic, which here I couldn't put because it's just too long, an acrostic, LUE, which means plague in Latin. So he has this long list of bad kings who are dividing their empires. So these are the bad kings, who are doing exactly what Christ was mourning about. And of course, Dante is mourning about in the Monarchia mostly. Now, why is this interesting? Well, first of all, obviously what we find here is that Dante is clearly creating a sort of a harmony between what he's doing in the Commedia and what he's doing here in the Cantos of the Ego. So to a certain extent, what we have here is a condemnation in heaven. So from an eschatological point of view, right, in heaven, of those kings who have divided their empire. So in the Monarchia, this might have sounded like a simple, citation, but here from the perspective of eschatology, you realize that these kings are actually punished for separating humanity from God, right? Because they are not obeying the order of God. And you have that, whilst at the same time you have the Ethiopians, that is the Africani, right, involved as instead the ones who will be saved, right, because if they have implicit faith, of course. Now, interestingly, the other, characters that are mentioned, as people who will come to judgment and, tell of and, judge the kings who are the plagues, the 7 plagues of the word are Persians. So we could say Asians, right? So they are the Africani and Asiatic. They are Persians. Now, in the entire commentary tradition, there is no reference whatsoever to this Persian. Who are they? We don't know. The only thing that is noted is that they are Persians. And even Pietro Alighieri, one of the best commentators of Dante, doesn't say much about this. However, Pietro is one of the first to notice that here Dante is saying that these Persian kings will be reading from the book of the Apocalypse, where we learn about obviously the Last Judgment. Now, interestingly, if you look at this chapter these chapters and other chapters of the Revelation, you find that in Revelation 16, an angel comes and empties, this bowl and dries up the river Euphrates. At this point, a real fight against all, kings start, the Armageddon, and this prepares the arrival of the Antichrist. Now, interestingly, this passage here mentions the kings that are going to do this as being the kings from the east. Now, in the normative, Christian tradition, this king from the East is Christ and the Christians. What happens is that by the time Joachim of Fiore arrives, this, kings from the East are not anymore projected onto the last judgment, Christ and the Christians, but are real, people. So Joachim of Flora projects the revelation against Augustine's, will onto history. And this changes entirely the way in which revelation will be used, from that moment onward. And this also allows for people to read Revelation in light of the apocryphal tradition, which had created a view of the apocalypse to, in fact, politics. And this tradition is mainly from Syria, from the Byzantine Empire, and is known in Italy mainly through the Tiburtine Sibyl, which was one of the sources of Joachim of Flora. So what does that mean? In those, visions, it is always a king, that will relieve people from, the plagues, right? But these plagues are always from the East. They are Persians. They are Saracens, Saladins, they are Muslim, right? So even in Joachim of Flora sees seven antichrists, and the number 7 is interesting. And all of them are from the East. And the first people from the East mentioned are always the Persians. Now, it's clear that Dante is not thinking of the Persians in the same way, right? Because these people they are positive. They are the good people. So what is Dante thinking of? And so if we give me 2 more minutes, if we think about Dante as biblicus, right? Dante, in my view, is thinking of a series of Old Testament passages where the Persians are, in fact, the messianic emperors. One of these passages is very famous, the dream of Balthasar that Daniel has to interpret. But Balthasar comes to, his kingdom comes to an end because he has divided it, right? And Daniel says, the people that will put, your bad kingdom, right? Because your bad king are the Persians. Now, but in Isaiah, right? These Persians are personified by Cyrus, the Persian emperor. And this is the text that is written, for Cyrus as the Messiah who will come, unify according to the will of God, unify Israel, which is divided, right? As we've learned, unify it, and will put people together. And together, God says, rain down your heavens from above and let the skies pour down righteousness, let the earth open and let them bring forth salvation, right? So Cyrus, who is not, he's not a Jew, but he's chosen to, actually create unity and reconstruct the Temple of Jerusalem so that salvation can come forth. And so my view is that, in the back of Dante's mind, the Persians are, although he can't accept that, he's chosen the Romans, right? He can't accept them. But this model is quietly not in the person of Cyrus, who's like a weak individual, as we know, according to Dante. But, the model of the Persian Empire is the model of the Messianic empire he has in mind. Thank you. So sorry.
Thank you, Paola. I think we have enough time for a couple of questions or more.
curiosity about I didn't get the meaning of obedience. So about someone when it comes
Yeah. So he obviously the if I have a slide, I'm not sure I have it because I have so many, but if I have it, it will be in English, right? So obediential is like the translation, and now I can't remember the proper Latin word, but it is like so it's a natural, obviously it's an inbuilt capacity, but it's a capacity that allows the human soul or mind to receive the image of God, to receive the perception of the order of God. So so I was thinking, when is this, for example, this capacity at work? Like in refers clearly by being acknowledging so much, like righteousness, so much love, that, this means that you are understanding, even if you don't know why, but you have that capacity to obey to the righteousness of God's order to an extent that is so great, right? In the case of Ripheus, because he was born before Christ. But I was thinking also of Cato, and in fact, like I've got to think back about Cato. So when is Cato's real capacity of obediential capacity shown? When, like in the Pharsalia, he prays to the gods and says, what is going on here? So often this obediential capacity appears when you are like appealing to the gods. So like the person that would have no, the character that would have no obediential capacity, right? And therefore he is like really the brute is for example, Ulysses, right? So he knows very well what his gods are, are wanting. But, he doesn't appeal to them. He appeals to something else instead, right? To the, so like it's really an ability to appeal to a greater order. Okay, so it doesn't have to be necessarily the God of the Christians. It is to obey to a greater order, to something that goes to a supernatural condition. And this is inborn. And so like if you yet to use Eliade, and he has what's its name? Eliade, it's the religious man. Right? It's a universal capacity to acknowledge, like a religious way of thinking, right? If you want to think in, like in contemporary terms, right? It's exactly that. Yeah. So, but I'll look it up because now I'm thinking, what is the Latin? I've read it, but I was so fixated on finding translations that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. As an example, if I'm not mistaken, of someone with, as you were saying, like certain implicit faith or implicit righteousness, despite her religion. And I thought that was interesting because I was doing a little bit of research on the relationship between Solomon and Sheba, at least in the Muslim tradition, because there was a story there that had to do with a bird that I was researching, the hoopoe.
Yep.
The
oh, yeah.
Is very important for Solomon, actually.
Yeah.
The hoopoe becomes this messenger, and it's specifically the hoopoe that tells Solomon that there is this group, the Queen of Sheba, and they're worshiping the sun, and we have to do something about this. It's like the hoopoe that reveals. And so that's in the Muslim tradition, but then in the tradition here, in the Christian tradition, is there a relationship that is similar between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba? Does King Solomon like bring the Queen of Sheba into the fold in some kind of way? And so maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Right. So all this, the Ethiopian, the Queen of Sheba and all the Ethiopian tradition is incredibly interesting. Like it's also like mentioned in a lot of the apocryphal tradition on the last world emperor, because they think it will be from Ethiopia. So it's like, but the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, it's generally interpreted exactly like that. That is, somebody is. The wisdom of Solomon, that is the wisdom of Christ, because obviously, it's interpreted Christologically. The wisdom of Christ is so big that, people will come to him even from other, like from all over the world. And so this actually gave rise to a lot of, legends about Ethiopia, Ethiopia being the locus where you will find the final universal conversion, right? And there is one passage now, I can't remember what's where exactly in the Gospels, but it's the Ethiopian eunuch, exactly. And again, you have another, Ethiopian who is clearly Ethiopian, but goes to Jerusalem because he's like interested in the worship of the, of God, and he's reading the old Bible, the Old Testament, and he meets Philip, the apostle Philip, and he asks, "Can you read this for me? Can you explain it?" And Philip explains it Christologically, right, according to the new law, and the Ethiopian, asks to be baptized. So there is like a continuous thread throughout with understanding the Queen of Sheba as the first in line of this interest for the law, for the Old Testament, but then eventually also the obviously the New Testament. So much so that really this line about Ethiopia stretching out their hands becomes like the key passage for Augustine to talk about implicit faith and salvation by faith only. Right, so we know very well the problem of salvation by faith only, and so on and so forth. So the works will come later, but it is so interesting that as I said, in a lot of the apocryphal tradition, they still, that I've mentioned, like the pseudo-Methodius Apocalypse, the Sibyl, and the legend of Alexander, right? In some of this apocryphal story, visions, it's actually the Ethiopians the kings of Ethiopia who will eventually beat the Antichrist. So it's like actually them who will beat the Antichrist. So it's like those kings of the East that we've seen in Revelation, those are the Ethiopians who will actually come and beat the Antichrist. I mean, the whole issue of the Antichrist is obviously very interesting and very complicated. But, they are given a great role in theology and exegesis and apocryphal tradition. And of course they represent, they are like the Africans. So it's like it's a metonymy, come si dice in inglese? Metonymy, to talk about the African continent, which is, quite unknown to most people at the time. Yeah.
May I ask you something quick, because then I have
Yeah.
to leave. Sorry about that, Paola. Thank you for this, beautiful and very rich discussion. Of course, I'm an interloper in Dante studies, so my question will be actually on a different author. But it came to my mind that in the Gerusalemme Liberata, Clorinda comes from Ethiopia, right? And of course, Tasso has all a very rich sort of set of reasons for having this character who eventually converts to Christianity, and having her as stemming from this particular area of Africa, which of course stands for Africa for sure. Yeah. But I wonder whether you have happened to think at all about these. I know that Tasso is certainly someone whom we are familiar with, but perhaps not your main thing,
Yeah.
but it it kind of came to mind because it seems to be part of a longer tradition of this particular meaning which Ethiopia has.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what absolutely. That's what it has this meaning, and of course, you have to also imply that there is like greater knowledge about like Ethiopia than we expect if you look at all the preachers work about traveling through North Africa and the Middle East. There's clear a lot of knowledge, and there is a lot of cultural exchange going on. But it's clearly like what I think that's the everyday knowledge, which is of course very, very important. But you also have to think that this discussion on implicit faith and therefore conversion, conversion is the key discourse. It starts in forever. It never stopped. But it obviously became an issue of scholastic debate very, very, very strongly at the end of the 13th century. And, and from then onward with the discussions in Barcelona, the disputations of Barcelona, where, they invite people from all different religions to discuss, like the issue of what is the right way of reading the Bible? Is it the law, the old law, the new law, and so on? So there is a real discussion, which up to a certain point is very open, and it invites often people of different religions to discuss about these issues, because ultimately what they want is like convert, right? So that's the ultimate. And what I think is that Dante obviously here is not, saying, I want to convert everyone, but ultimately this is his preoccupation. This is his preoccupation. And he doesn't want to do it like through, the part that's interesting to me is that he doesn't want to do it, obviously the Bible is fundamental, but he doesn't want to do it through a spiritual authority. He wants to create the conditions for people to choose their, obediential capacity, right? And in that sense, that is a messianic empire, right? Where, then the heavens can open and, and things can pour down and things like that. But to me, that's the interesting thing. And Dante is not like all these apocryphal things, like, the legend of Alexander the Sibyl, they are all about messianic empire, right? But they are apocryphal. So what Dante is doing here, I think, is more interesting because he's rooting it, very much in the real canon, let's say, right? And he's doing it whilst also, of course, displaying all this knowledge in the Monarchia about, whatever. But and in that sense, and since, we can talk about Averroes. It's interesting that this whole discussion starts with Averroes, right? If you see it, in real terms, he knows very well who Averroes is. Right. So it's appealing to a tradition which is really, universal, because he thinks that it is part of the same intellect, really intellect, because everybody has this capacity.
Thank you, Paola. One of the things, last week we were talking about the monarchia in that Dante Alighieri book, and you spent your whole career studying the Bible in an academic way, and take the Bible seriously in a way that perhaps others weren't at the time. And your point, you start with the monarchia as a text that according to a lot of interpretations, historiographically, is a secularizing, right? It's almost the invention of the secular, right? There's this other domain, and it ought to be somehow independent from the church, which is empire, which is politics. And so you're kind of careful tracing about how the sources of this are biblical, right? Is that those two things cannot be totally separated at all. And so your term messianic empire is sort of bringing back in the fact that he's not talking about something that's a disconnect from religion or something, but it's the institution of the church has to have its instrumental role, and the empire has to have its instrumental role, but it's unified. And Solomon is, of course, himself is somebody who worships foreign gods, right? And that's part of the reason why his salvation is in question. And so it does like to pick these characters that are the questionable ones, right? So I don't know. Maybe my question would be, well, what about Virgil? What's your feeling about Virgil? You mentioned Cato, but
yeah, will he be saved? Yeah, I should ask Vittorio Montemaggi about that. But he's like on a quest to save Virgil. Well, like it is. So I was thinking about this actually the other night. I was thinking, what about Virgil? Because so I think if there is any hope for Virgil in this plan, is that Dante is trying to present him sometimes as pensive, like as some, like as a character who evolves more and more, like as a pensive guide.
he finally sees and gets it in world repentance.
Exactly. So yes, so that's I think where you would find like an opening for Virgil, but certainly like there is nowhere there's nobody ever said once you are like. So I was even thinking, so what is limbo? Like this is like we always assume that Dante has really decided that limbo, let's say, it's closed, right? But maybe he didn't really imply for it to be totally closed until before the end of times. But it's really a maybe, right? It's so I don't know. But I think if there is any salvation for the poor Virgil, is that he's shown as like growing in his understanding. Like he has the very same fact that, and I think maybe this is what Montemaggi was mentioning. Now that I think of it, the very same fact that he's acknowledging Beatrice, right? And, like this divine power that comes to him and says, okay, can you please do this? Could be a sign that he's acknowledging this supernatural, capacity. I think this is really key to the supernatural capacity, the fact that you are acknowledging that there's something higher than you. And so the Beatrice, coming and him obeying, that's a real obediential capacity. So, yeah, I will have to talk to Vittorio and say maybe we are, we are on the right.
Well, structurally, I mean, Virgil serves a function, and so to save Ripheus, right, is to sort of say the character, a minor character, a tiny little character, right, is to sort of put the possibility out there. So it's really the largeness of the vision of Dante. I mean, you've done it so well with the Persians and the Ethiopians, and that this largeness, would of course include Virgil, but we can't see it.
We can't see it.
And so the far shore, or the depth of the ocean, we can't see it, but it puts it out there as possible.
Yeah, it just, it's just rehearsed, right? But it's it's very good. I'll have to think about that. But yeah, funny that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about it last night, about Virgil. I know it's, this is like a very sort of like dense, close reading to a certain extent, right? But what really interests me is to really show that, that Dante as a biblical scholar is a serious thing. It's a...
And that he can come to other conclusions.
He can come to other conclusions by reading the same book. This is like what he does like greatly with the 12th sword episode, right? To prove that there are not the two swords of secular. And so if we want to bring it back to your idea, are there these two authorities and things like, he says, none of this is true. The Bible doesn't say that, and so he goes through an analysis, which is very literal, narrative, and harmonizing, right? The to come to an interpretation nobody had put forward. If perhaps there's something similar in Occam, and that says it all. Yeah.
Thinking also, the eagle's voice that comes out is that whole musical thing, whether it's a stringed instrument or a wind instrument, and you use this word harmony in a technical way, which is the harmonization of the two testaments. But that's kind of what that is too, the harmonization of all the different voices and the unison of it. And that's his expansive vision of all of this difference, all of this extent within time and space that doesn't lose its individuality,
No.
that can come together in harmony, which requires difference to be harmony.
Yes.
With one voice.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's every time I read Dante in the end, I just say, how did he do it? It's like sometimes there is, like the feeling that, okay, you're reading too much into it. But no, the precision of, how he really plays every small detail is like, and in that specific, passage you're citing, he's also like creating new words to do this. Right? So the words don't exist. I'm going to make them up. But so it's not just like making new interpretations. It's making new words to talk about those, this different vision. Right? So it's like really creating meaning and sense at so many levels from, independently. It doesn't exist. I'm happy to do it. So, yes.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you to you.